Hi, François. Welcome to Mental Travelers.
Can I ask you a little bit about yourself? I
Yeah,
saw
sure.
from your website that you define yourself as a outsider artist, I think. And that, that terminology sort of triggered my curiosity.
So you wonder why do I describe myself as an outsider artist?
Yeah, I think.
I'm Tuoya Wulan, that's my full name. I'm a student of English literature in Peking University, and I'm calling myself a outsider artist because I taught myself in illustration, and also I'm always been very interested in visual artworks, but I was not trained in art schools. But somehow I got involved in all kinds of art projects. So I kind of have an insider's perspective, but also not being recognized as a fully inside, I guess. Um, I'm not technically um, advanced enough to be called a artist, so I call myself an illustrator.
Okay, that's interesting.
Uh-huh. So ask any questions you want to know.
No, no, no. This is already this is already sort of helpful for me to understand.
Would you like to offer a self-introduction?
Yeah, sure, I definitely can. So, my name is François Mouillot. Um, I usually say in professional context that I'm an academic based in Hong Kong. I'm an assistant professor at the Hong Kong Baptist University in a department called the Department of Humanities and Creative Writing. My work really is a kind of mix between cultural studies, media studies, music studies, and I guess critical theory or philosophy more broadly speaking. Um, that's how I usually introduce myself in more professional context. But of course, I think I'm much more than my job. So I'm also just a French person who has traveled a fair bit, who now lives in Hong Kong. I'm a music lover. I'm a avid traveler. I love to travel. I like to say of myself that I'm a curious person, that I try to be tolerant and open-minded to discover always new perspectives and to always try to understand new perspectives. That's perhaps how I would describe myself in non-professional settings.
I guess like my first impression of you is from the Inside Out Art Museum in Beijing, and I really liked your talk on underground music. So I wonder how, as a scholar, did you decide to like engage in this area, underground music research?
Mm. Do you want the long story or the abridged
Yeah, tell me the
story?
long story.
The long story. The long story then begins, I think, with me discovering metal, heavy metal, when I was a teenager. A band called Iron Maiden, a British band, and just falling head over heels into music and this particular style of music as a young teenager. And I guess it's the typical story, right? This type of music, the primary audience is young teenage boys, um, white boys, we might even say. But in anyways, that's how I really got into music. Until that point, I didn't really know too much about music, was not that interested in music, but that sort of hooked me. And over the next few years, I became a fan. I discovered more and more artists. I started to play music myself, to play this kind of, these kinds of sounds that I was hearing and that I felt were so cool. And then, by the end of high school, I was like, well, there's nothing else that I want to do except something that has to do with music. Shortening the story a little bit, but I was able to go to Canada actually to do some studying, to pursue a major in music for my undergraduate degree. Over the course, actually double major in music and philosophy. Over the course of that degree, my taste kind of expanded tenfold because in university well, you're exposed to a lot of different things, the taste of other people, and of course the classes that I was taking. So I got turned on to a lot of different music, all the whole range of Western art music, jazz, as well as more contemporary kind of contemporary classical and more experimental kind of work. And I think in that degree, I sort of developed a new affinity or a new passion for, I would say, contemporary experimental music, 20th century music. And I started playing in an ensemble that was run by my university, which was a free improvisation ensemble. Very abstract music, very like it's basically making noise, right? And a lot of people just listen to it as like, okay, well, anybody can do this, I can do on my guitar as well. It's and call it free improvisation. But somehow that became a lot of fun to play, and I met a lot of interesting people that way, just listening, going to shows, playing this kind of music. And as time went, I also realized that, okay, these styles of music that I felt were separate, like metal, punk, hardcore, and these types of underground jazz and experimental music. I don't know, why do I like them all? What is it that, like what do they have in common that sort of makes me like them all? Um, and I think one reason for my liking of these things was the way in which people were doing this, regardless of the establishment, regardless of whether a wide audience was there for it or not. So there was a spirit, I would say, of doing things and playing these types of music in spite of what the rest of the community or society would be thinking about them. And as I was going to shows, I sort of kind of became more interested or started to notice as well that a lot of the venues or the bars that I was going to listen to it, actually they featured all of this different type of music. So free improv was necessarily all of a sudden not separate from metal or from punk. They were all kind of playing in the same places, like small venues, because these were not musics that had wide appeal, I would say. And so, broadly speaking, I would say that this was how I got interested in this type of underground, broadly defined type of music. And then I moved to Canada to do my PhD. I moved to Montreal to do my PhD. And Montreal is an interesting city in that it has a very lively creative music scene all across town in different genres of music. And so I started becoming friends with people within that scene, especially record label peoples, and musicians as well, and realizing that yes, they were doing this type of music, for example, that would be called post rock. I became acquainted with people in the group Godspeed You Black Emperor and their label, and talking to them and spending time with them is like, well, actually, we like all of the same type of music, and going to festivals, realizing again that there were connections between the world of post rock, of free improvisation, of punk, of hardcore, of some kind of electronic music, and that these types of marginal music, outside musics, perhaps we could say, we're all kind of living in to some extent the same kind of ecosystem. So that's how I ended up wanting to research this for my PhD. Um, the underground or experimental music scene in Montreal, made up of all of these different groups of people. So that was my way into becoming a scholar about this, I would say, is doing this PhD on this particular place and group of people and structures. I had the opportunity to go for a while to Hong Kong, and I came here, and a while became more permanent. As I was settled in Hong Kong, I started to also look for the same type of places and people in Hong Kong, and I did, and then it became interesting to me to sort of to trace the conditions as well as the motivations for doing this kind of music in a place like Hong Kong. and how different that was from the other places where I had encountered this type of music before.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I liked how you combined your experience from all over the world to academic studies. And also, when I was reading your book and the article you recommended, I found that your research is quite tied to practice. That is to say, your writing never left the actual art practice that is going on in specific sites, whether in Canada or Hong Kong or other cities
Yeah,
or countries.
yeah.
So, what would you say that is the main attraction or the difficulties you've encountered in doing this type of research that is practice oriented?
Mm. I It's a very good question, I think, or a very rich question. And you're right to point out that in my writing, I rarely leave that site or that place. This is where I'm potentially quite a cultural studies scholar, in that I believe that context is very important, that we cannot truly understand um, any particular person or phenomena or activity if we don't really understand its context. So for me, whenever I talk about something, an artist or a place or whatever, or a record label, it's difficult to not go into some kind of description, some kind of attention to the context. Again, broadly speaking, I'm really interested in trying to understand this thing in this context and what makes it what it is in relation to this context. But of course, context is elastic, right? Uh, the context of experimental music in Hong Kong is, well, we might say, okay, there's a local context, there's an immediate context, but then, which might be the context of a scene, for example, or a neighborhood in Hong Kong. But then there's the context of the city itself, um, or and then there's the context of the region, the country, maybe China, and then the context of the region, and then there's the world. After all, is also a context. So how to, where to stop when engaging with the context of a practice is one of the difficulties. If we're talking, let's say, for example, free improvisation as a kind of practice, it's very difficult to say that it has like a local identity in its music. A lot of this music is played with the same instruments, with the same techniques, with a lot of the same sounds in many parts of the world.
Mm.
Free improvisers in Hong Kong don't sound that different from free improvisers in Montreal or in France or in Beijing, I think. So then you cannot really talk about identity in the music itself, or perhaps it's there, but it's very elusive. It's very slippery to talk about. So then you start talking about the social context, the political context, the material conditions that make the practice of that particular music possible. And then
Mm.
you're talking about really then something more than just a music, which I think is what always interested me, actually. One thing that I didn't mention in my little bio is that I did an undergraduate degree in music and philosophy, and then I started a master's in ethnomusicology. But a year into that, I was growing very dissatisfied with it. Not because it wasn't interesting, but it just wasn't what I wanted to do. And so I finished my master's in a cultural and language studies department, actually. And then I did my PhD in communication studies. So I really moved away from studying music to studying culture and media with a focus on music. So perhaps that speaks about also my interest in trying to stick to the examination of context of cultural production.
Yeah, I think it's great that you brings up the topic of contextualization. Um, I mean, as a student of literature, I feel like I don't know enough about music artworks to really explain it to others. But when I was reading, whether it's musicology or your writings about underground music, I find the way that we theorize or philosophize this type of phenomenon actually decontextualizes the artworks themselves. Because these cultural mediums, whether it's visual artworks or sonic artworks, they have their special type of expression, right? Whether it's sound or vision. And we all kind of reduce them into words, into text. And how would you regard this phenomenon? I mean, could you really explain the experience of music through words?
I feel that I don't write about music in a way. I write about the people who make the music, and that's my approach to it. Um, you're very right to say that it's different. Musicology, for example, is very different from the cultural studies of music. And perhaps it's the same in literature as well, where in literature, I mean, a lot of people spend time getting deep into the text and really trying to understand the mechanisms of the text within the text. Musicology does that as well, right? It analyzes music in relation to melody and harmony and rhythm within a particular piece of music. At least traditionally, that's what musicology has done, or a branch of musicology. Of course, we have ethnomusicology, which is kind of musical anthropology, and that's where musicology sort of starts to go more, okay, let's talk about these pieces of music in relation to the people that make it, right? So what is so different about that and what I'm trying to do? Well, again, it's a question of where do we place the focus, and I think for me the focus is still less the music itself than it is the particular social, cultural, political dynamics that animate the making of a specific music. The reason why I moved away from the field of ethnomusicology again was not because it wasn't interesting. It was super interesting, but I had two primary problems with it for myself. One is that the kind of ethnomusicology that I was exposed to was essentially Western people looking at non-Western music, whether it was music from the Caribbean, the Latin America, from different parts of Asia. Okay. Whereas my interest was really in the kinds of music that were directly around me, that I was making, that I was engaging with. So these types of, underground music practice. And I found that ethnomusicology perhaps didn't give me the tools that I was looking for to understand this. Perhaps it was a mistake on my part, but I felt at that time that it just I could not say anything that I wanted to say, perhaps, in the discipline of ethnomusicology per se. Another problem I had with ethnomusicology personally is ethnomusicology pays a lot of attention to the details of the music because they're super important. Um, but it's not what I was interested in doing. I was not super interested in doing detailed music analysis. And I didn't want to spend the rest of my academic career sort of transcribing chants from some remote island in the Pacific or something. Not that it's not cool, it's super cool, but it's just not
Mm.
what I wanted to do. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, and I do recall that in your book, the book you edited, Fractured Scenes, that you mentioned specific problems in the cultural, historical, political context in Hong Kong underground music making. That is
yeah,
to say, you have problems like high rent and difficulty in finding venues, getting permissions for performance. This type of specific questions that people are encountering in their actual process of making music in the everyday details. So I guess it's really a lively approach for me as a reader. Helps me to visualize how the creators are actually trying to present their works and their journeys in doing it. So, how would you describe your experience in Hong Kong, and how does that experience kind of help you refine your approach in your current research?
Yeah. Yeah, that's also a good question. And in fact, my experience in Hong Kong is quite distinct from my experience, let's say, in Montreal in the years prior. One very important factor is that I feel like much more of an outsider, um, to use that word, uh, in Hong Kong than I did perhaps in Montreal, in the sense that there's a language barrier for me. I unfortunately really do not speak Cantonese well enough yet to have a certain level of deep engagement with some of the activities of the scene. Um, Whereas in Montreal, in fact, people always kept on telling me, "Oh, you're the perfect person to study, the experimental music scene in Montreal because you speak both English and French, the two language that the city speaks." And so very different experience. And so in Hong Kong, it's always been a trick of saying, "Well, I'm not really one with the culture. I'm always kind of going to be on the edge of this culture, even though Hong Kong is also an international city, so um, it is, like people have always welcomed me very nicely and at events and everything. Some of it is beyond my possible understanding, so I kind of refocus my attention on the things that I can understand and I can write about, which is perhaps broader kind of contextual dynamics and things like this, because um, I think my limitation, I'm trying to make use of my limitation of being kind of not having the linguistic skills to really do a deep kind of ethnographic inquiry of this particular movement or scene or whatever we want to call it. And so I kind of skirt around that and I try to sort of latch on to the things that I can latch on to and really talk and think about that. Knowing full well that, of course, I'm not pretending or I'm not intending to give a full picture. Um, it's just what I write about, and when I write about the Hong Kong underground music scene, it's simply my own perspective as a kind of outsider.
Mm.
And I would hope, if there's anything that I hope that my work accomplishes, is to give people the desire to do more of it, to
Mm.
say, okay, this is not enough. There's also this and that, this person is not really talking about. And that's what I would hope at least that my work kind of accomplishes, that it makes people dissatisfied enough with my account of the Hong Kong underground scene that they want to give their own account. Because I think that's what is honestly truly needed at this point. It's such a marginal little scene within, well, first within Hong Kong, and then even within China and within the rest of Asia and the world, that I think it's important to be telling this story about this super like marginal little pocket of people doing interesting things. And I'm not claiming to do it right, but I'm at least claiming to want to bring a little bit more attention to it.
Yeah, I think you definitely did that. At least I'm focusing on it.
Good.
And
That's great. That's great to hear.
I'm glad that you bring up the topic of marginalized, or what we call outsiders
Yeah.
phenomenon, whether it's linguistic or the kind of barriers we
Yeah.
encounter in everyday life.
Yeah.
S- Is your topic a particularly mainstream topic in academia, or is it also sort of in the periphery? I'm not
Mm.
sure if I phrased it very well.
I think it's a general kind of fact or state of things that um, small things or marginal things are usually only going to be of appeal to a smaller number of people. But for sure, different marginalized perspectives have become much more mainstream in recent years across the globe, right? So, very obvious examples might be, women's rights in many different parts of the world. Of course, there was the Me Too movement, which started in the West and that found some echoes in other parts of the world, but that's an example of a marginalized perspective that became much more prominent in uh, in mainstream discourse, for lack of better words. But then it depends. Not all marginalized perspectives will gather the same amount of attention or interest, in academia included. So that's just something that we have to navigate and to live with. I feel that I'm in a interesting, if sometimes tricky, spot where I'm not fully an ethnomusicologist or in ethnomusicology, um, where ethnomusicology does a lot of very focused examination of a particular culture or of a particular group of people, and that's what it does. I'm not really fully that. I'm also kind of interested in questions and debates that take place in the field of media studies and cultural studies, which might be much less detailed in terms of place and in terms of specificities, right? That's on the verge of sociology as well. And sociology likes to explain phenomena, right? Like if sociology makes often kind of universalizing claims,
Mhm.
um, which sometimes I have problems with. Uh, but so I'm drawing from a little bit of both, like how do we navigate between talking about and writing about the specific, the very specific, but at the same time make hopefully points that can apply to other things or that can say something about bigger dynamics. My approach is often to say I try to look for the whole world in a grain of sand,
Mm.
in if that makes sense.
Will and
I
Blake.
uh
That comes from Will and Blake.
oh really? That's not my reference for it actually. My reference for it is Leibniz. I don't know if you
Oh,
know. Yeah, it where it comes to me is from the monadology, where he claims that yes, we can see the whole of the world in one of the monads, in one of the sand, the grain of sands, really. But I didn't know it was a William Blake thing as well.
I think it was always in Buddhism as well. There are many cultural
Right,
references to that
right,
line, to see
right,
the world in a grain of sand.
right.
Um,
Yes, I'd heard about that. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to do, right? So. Uh, that usually raises suspicion, or at least it may not command mainstream interest right off the bat, because at the end of the day, it's like, oh, this person is writing about a grain of sand. Let's say the grain of sand is the Hong Kong experimental music.
mm.
Who cares about this grain of sand, except perhaps the few people who are invested in it? But what I'm trying to say is like, well, more people should care about this grain of sand because it tells us things that are relevant to other grains of sand.
That's a very good analogy. Do you recall any specific inspirations, like people or events, that kind of helped you find your current area? That is to say, transition from ethnographical musicology to culture studies.
I was doing my ethnomusicology degree and kind of feeling out of place and not really sort of doing the things that I wanted to be doing. and being kind of lost. And at that moment, I was living in Ontario, which is another part of Canada. Um, and I was doing this ethnomusicology degree in the city of Toronto, but I was not living in Toronto. I was living in a smaller town, about 100 kilometers away where I did my undergrad. And so I was commuting between the town that I was living in and Toronto. And that was a fairly long commute. So I would only go into Toronto when I had like classes and stuff. But basically, as I was growing dissatisfied with my place in ethnomusicology, um, I said, well, why don't I look for degrees in the town that I live, right, in the university where I did my undergrad. So it was the motivation, or at least how I transitioned into language and cultural studies at that time, was significantly motivated by practical and logistical concerns about not having to commute to go to school. Of course, I felt that okay, it would be nice. It seemed like a program in language and culture felt closer to what I wanted to do. And I had conversations with teachers in that department who told me, oh, yes, of course, you can study music uh, in our department because that was my concern. It was like, okay, I want to study, I still want to study music practices, music forms, but from a cultural perspective, not from a musicological or ethnomusicological perspective. So that was my concern is, okay, can I do that in a culture, language and culture department? And so the people that I, discussed with, the professors in that at that university called the University of Guelph, uh, said, yes, absolutely, you can do it. We may not have quite the expertise on music per se, but there's a range of, tools and theories that perhaps you will be able to sort of make your own and study music with. Um, so that was the process of returning, or rather moving to cultural studies, not really knowing what cultural studies was, to be honest. My knowledge of it was very I knew next to nothing about it except that I wanted to study music from a cultural perspective. Um, and then as I was finishing my master's degree there, one of my professors, her name is Frédérique Arroyas, she's actually a French studies professor, said, I was thinking of doing PhDs, and I was at that point I was looking at more cultural studies program and different kinds of programs, even anthropology and or sociology. And she said, well, there is a professor from Montreal that you really should meet. His name is Will Straw. He wrote a lot about music scenes. And I think, like you two would get along well. And it turns out that this professor, Will, was coming to the University of Guelph to give a talk. Frederic decided to arrange for a meeting between me and Will. And I think, remember, you want stories, I'll give you a story. The day of the meeting, my toilet broke at home. So I was left with like an overflowing toilet, and I was like, okay, I have to call the plumber. I cannot leave home until this is fixed. And then Frederick was calling me saying, where are you? Like we're here after Will's talk. You missed the talk, but we're at this restaurant at the bar. You need to come. You need to meet this guy. And so I in the end, I got the plumber, and then I was able to leave home and to meet them at this restaurant, and that's how I met Will Straw. And I had this little conversation with him. And he's a very gentle and open-minded guy and very curious. And so I was talking a little bit with him, and then I said, "Oh, uh, I'm now applying for PhDs. This is kind of what I'm interested in studying. Would you be interested in supervising a project like this?" And he said, yeah, yeah, sure, sure, like apply. It's and so at that point I looked up his affiliation, and I realized he's not even in a cultural studies department. He's in a department called communication studies. I'd never heard about communication studies really, and certainly didn't think that I would apply for a communication studies program, but I did because of Will Straw, and then that's one of the programs that I ended up being accepted at, and that I moved to Montreal because of that. So I feel that there was a lot of kind of serendipity um, in this particular portion of my scholastic path. There was not a lot of planning, not a lot of knowing what I was going to do, except that I was moving with the general sense that I wanted to study music from a cultural perspective. How I was going to do that was not very clear to me. So it just happened. And I'm glad it did, like, and then, I moved to Montreal, and it with a completely different project, by the way. I got accepted in my PhD for a completely different project from the one that I ended up doing. So, like the early month in Montreal kind of like opened me up to what was going on in Montreal. And Will himself being a scholar of like he had written a fair bit about Montreal. Then he sort of stirred me in that direction. Why don't you do a project on the Montreal indie slash experimental music scene? That's how it happened. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds quite a journey. I really appreciate your honesty.
Yeah. That's something that I should do. That I should mention as well is that I have never felt like a born academic. I don't come from a family where there are many people who are scholars, or who have studied a lot. I never really set out to be like, oh, I want to be a professor of studying this kind of thing. I was just simply following my interest, and I said, okay, I would like to do something with music. And then I ended up studying music in university, and then I realize that okay, music, you can write about music. You don't only have to play it or to listen to it. You can also try to understand it. It was little gradual increments in discovering new things and possibilities that led me to that particular path. But it was always very step by step for me. There was never any master plan to achieve this goal where okay, I get a PhD and I become a professor. Um, that just wasn't my path.
Yeah, I can 100% resonate with that because my family is a worker family. And well, most of the time they envision me as like planning my life, but for me it's all about confusion and chaos. I just not knowing much of what I was going to do in the future, and also talking to different people and kind of trying to reorganize my thoughts about research and readings all the time. It's all happening at the same time, and I can't
Yeah.
really say that if I have a plan or not. In your writings, the fractured scene, the book, I can really see that you bring in a lot of people, the artists, the critics, the curators, um, the researchers. They are all in this one book, and it includes interviews and personal reflections, as well as standard scholars' journal articles. So I want to know the story behind the book as well. How to decide to compile such a project that's sort of like an assemblage of everything?
Mm.
And is there any difficulties in making this book, or how do you find these people that kind of agreed to be involved in this project?
There's two main reasons I would say why the book turned out to be this way. The first one is that, well, prosaically speaking, the number of scholars who may be willing and able to write something about the Hong Kong underground scene is very limited. So my co-editor and I, Damien and I, were talking, and it's like, okay, so either we write a book ourselves, which would then end up kind of being a monograph rather than edited collection. Uh, we could do that, but like or we have to consider different types of perspectives or voices as expert voices. That is to say that, the experts about the Hong Kong underground music scene are also the people who are doing it, are also the people who are organizing the events. Um, they know a lot. And so in that sense, if we're going to do like a book that has more than our voices, then we need to have people who may not qualify or may not call themselves scholars, but still have, we feel, a lot of knowledge about this and interesting things to say about doing weird music in Hong Kong. That was one reason. The other reason, it was also helped by the context, as always, right? I was at that time a researcher at the School of Creative Media, where my friend and co-editor Damien was working. So it's essentially an art school. So it's a place that already gathers together theoreticians as well as artists as well as curators. So I think it was not necessarily a big stretch for us to imagine a conversation that would include people who are not strictly um, into theory or into research, but also who are practitioners in different ways. So yeah, I feel that the environment of the School of Creative Media was just kind of like naturally influencing us to think in this way. Um, so yeah, those two things I would say are the reason why the book turned out that way. And frankly, also it was nice that the publisher Palgrave, or the person that we dealt with at Palgrave, actually didn't bat an eye. He was totally and directly on board with the idea of having like an edited collection that would feature different type of writing and types of perspectives.
Well, I imagine editorial work would be very um laborious or very difficult because I've tried editing books and journals, and it's really time consuming. And you do mention that you have this language barrier as well, that you can't really speak Cantonese. I do notice there are like Hong Kong local artists in the book involved. So how were you having this conversation with them with the language barrier? Did you hire a translator or is someone helping in the process?
We didn't, and probably this is one of the limitations of the book. Absolutely, is that a lot of the people who are in the book are people whom we knew already that were within our networks, and that established a degree of trust, of course, that when we approached them to ask them, okay, would you want to be doing this, they probably would more readily say yes because they knew it was us. Some of them were not necessarily very comfortable with English, but their level of English was sufficient, definitely, was good enough for them to write something that we could then work with and maybe edit a little bit and then include in the book. But that was absolutely one of the concerns that Damien and I had, is that we did not want to be these two white guys who don't speak Cantonese just pontificate about Hong Kong experimental music in the book. Um, so we were very concerned about this, and in terms of, okay, let's really try to not make the book about us, and to have the people who in a way have far more legitimacy to talk about it, to tell their story. Um, so there was that concern. We did not want to be perceived, or we did not want to be neo-colonialists or something, people coming from the West and then explaining something about the local life. That was a trap we didn't want to fall into. But still, there is the limit that, of course, there are many more people who would have very interesting stories to tell, but didn't because there was the medium of the book is English, and so they didn't feel comfortable or supported enough, perhaps, to tell their story in Cantonese. So that's definitely one of the limits. Another limit, as far as I'm concerned, is definitely the lack of gender diversity in the book. It's something that we were trying to work on, but I feel that we kind of fell short uh, with it in this book. So those are my two regrets, if I can say.
So, do you have any future work plans, or what projects are you working on right now?
Yes, definitely. Things that so I'm writing another article. I'm these days I'm fascinated with the roles of platforms in the mediation of the Hong Kong music scene. So that's part of what you saw and heard actually uh, at the museum is this article um, about where I talk about the use of digital platforms from promotion and organization. Um, I'm writing one more article on this, on the concept of scene from an augmentation perspective, and still taking the case of Hong Kong as an example. But once I'm done with this, I'm ready to move on to other things. Not because it's no longer interesting, but simply because it's time for me to think about some other things. I have a new project on ethnic minorities in Hong Kong in the music industries. So I want to start research and writing on that. That's one of my next projects. I do have the project as well of trying to finally publish my PhD dissertation about the Montreal indie music scene
Mm.
into a book. So that's another project as well.
So the social platforms for the music distribution is your
Yeah.
current focus.
These days, yes, I feel I'm really sort of getting near the end of what I have to say about that. Um, but yes, I found it super interesting and fascinating how creative some of the people in the Hong Kong scene are with social media platforms. And again, I'm very interested in what this means in relation to the Hong Kong cultural context, what it means also for how we understand cultural scenes. Um, yeah, about the place of technology more broadly in social theory and social forms. Yeah, I'm.
Mm.
But I don't think I think I'll take a break from that after this article that I'm currently writing.
Yeah, I look forward to.
Maybe one day, like a few days ago, I sort of thought, oh, wow, I have like maybe 3 or 4 articles on this topic. Maybe that can be turned into some kind of book, like a collection uh,
Mm.
of my writings on that particular topic. But I don't think it will come right away.
Yeah, I look forward to read your new article. And
Well, thank you. I have to finish writing it. I don't know how you feel about writing, but for me, I like writing, but it's always a very demanding, at times torturous process. So particularly generating the first draft is there's a lot of self-doubt involved for me, and so yeah, it's an involved process.
definitely for me as well, I'm a huge procrastinator. Because I sort of have this psychological barrier of kind of wanting to produce a very perfect first draft, but it's never gonna be that way, right? Uh,
Exactly.
And the way you imagine what you will be writing is definitely not going to be what you wrote in the end. And so I have to cope with this disappointment and really move on to revision.
I feel very similar to what you just described. And you know, I've gotten better with accepting the fact that thinking does not happen outside of writing. Um, if that makes sense. Of course, we can have ideas, but ideas get truly shaped and sometimes transformed when we write them. So for me, thinking is kind of inseparable from writing. And then knowing that you just have to write in order to think and to be open to the fact that, yes, things are going to change, things are not going to match um, what you thought it would be like. Um, you mentioned revisions. I know some people, some writers who say that they don't like to do revisions. They don't like the editing process. But I feel this is probably one of my most enjoyable part of the process, is finally having something on the page that I can sort of return to and make better, chisel, like at the end, for me it's like I get this visual metaphor of, okay, I have the sculpture and I'm just gonna chisel at it to make it to make it look better.
How long does it take normally for you to this entire process?
The entire process, I mean, from like start to like final product.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's it's I'm not a very fast writer, so my way of doing it is really to try to write a little every day. So to make writing into like part of my daily routine. Um and then after that, but the point is I can't really do that because if I write on the same thing every day, day after day, I lose distance from it and I get lost in it and I get frustrated. So I need to give myself breaks of like a few days of letting it sit and then returning to it to continue. Um, and then, of course, if we're talking about academic writing, then you're sending it for review, and then that can take that can take a while to come back to you. So I would say that from start to finish, from the moment I start writing to the moment something really comes out, it's usually about a year. But I quite enjoy the process of revision. Like I said, I quite enjoy the process of receiving comments on what I wrote because that makes me feel like, okay, that's what I need to do in order to make it better. I think writing also has to be at some point a kind of collaborative practice. Or at least I enjoy it when other people kind of get involved in the process.
I have another topic that I'm really curious about. That is to say, you did mention to me that you live with disability.
Yep.
I do want to know more about your experience and also what it means to live with the condition and also being a writer, being a thinker, and being a educator.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's so many things that could be said about this. I'm going to try to be concise. Well, yes. So my primary disability is a form of cerebral palsy. It's technically called Little syndrome. Um, yeah, a lot of people when they see me, they see that I walk different, that like my gait is different, that maybe I don't have quite the balance and whatnot. And so the usual question is, "Oh, what's wrong with your legs?" And I say, well, there's actually nothing wrong with my legs. It's my brain. I have brain damage. Um, so that's what it is. It's damage to the central nervous system that creates my condition. Um, it's I used to say that it is from birth, but it is not. In fact, it's trauma that occurred but very early on after I was born. We don't exactly know what it is that created permanent damage to this tiny part of my nervous system. But it is not congenital. It is some kind of accident that happened that created this condition. And so I've always lived with it. I don't have, and I'm convinced that this is really central to my experience, is that I don't have any other form of experience of living. It was always with this body, sets of limitations, which to me, many times I don't experience as limitations. They're just the basic condition of my body and my going about in the world. It's always been a part of who I am, and I never really question it. Of course, the only time that it's reminded that I'm reminded of it is when I interact with other people, when I interact with the outside world, which reminds me in a myriad different ways that, oh, okay, I'm not quite like the average body out there. So for me, it's really just part of part of who I am as a person. It's the same as the color of my eyes or the color of my hair. It's just my body. And I was raised in a way where, that was not made to be a particular factor of who I should be or how I should be. My mom really fought hard uh, well, I mean, she really always told me you're normal. It's just like there's some specificity to your body, but otherwise you're absolutely normal, it's a term that I don't like now, but that's the way I was raised. But of course, um, I think for her, it took a lot of fighting to make sure that society, 1980s France, would treat me as normal so that I could go to a regular school and this type of things. I don't know what to say beyond this, and that I never thought that it was ever a factor preventing me to do any of the things that I wanted to do. Um, I never nurtured a great desire to be a basketball player, you know, or like I never felt restrained by it. And I think that's because I've been living with it since day one. So it kind of shaped my perspectives of the world and knowing instinctively what I can and cannot do. So perhaps, but this is only really a perhaps, there's it naturally sort of pulled me towards things that were less physical in nature, like reading, writing, playing music, where that was not going to be a kind of, yeah, a kind of factor. That's the first part of the story. In more recent times, I've started to reflect more on the disability aspect, just how that impacts my way of seeing. I've started to teach disability studies, which in itself is an interesting process.
Have you encountered any sort of bias or discriminations? I'm not sure if this is a good question.
I think it's a good question. To be honest, I probably have, but never felt that it was going to be it never felt like a major block in my life. Um, and if somebody said one day, oh, we cannot have this person here or there or doing this or that because they have a disability, I never knew about it. They never told me, or nobody ever told me about it. So I don't feel like I was ever really truly actively marginalized by people because of it. However, I'm well aware that society, the built environment, the attitudes of people, the way people think, um, are not attuned to the reality of differently abled bodies and minds. So there is marginalization on that level, constantly, all the time. When, if I go out of my house and I go in different places and I realize, oh well, that place was definitely not designed with accessibility in mind. That's a form of marginalization that I experience. It's every day, it's everywhere, but it's not like something that I feel as though somebody is attacking me with it. I think it's just there, the world.
This podcast I'm making, Mental Travelers, is actually taking many perspectives. It suggests that traveling is not only physical, it can also be mental. Mental
Yeah.
in the sense of being crazy, as well as mental being the sense of immersed in one's mind.
Yeah.
So I guess talking to thinker is also for me a traveling experience for me to open my eyes to perspectives and different thoughts.
What do you plan on doing with this podcast series? I mean, how do you see it developing?
I want to build a digital archive for the people I'm having dialogue with. Um, because most of the podcast platforms they are audio based, but I there's so many things that I could add on it, images, videos, text for the people who are interested in the materials I'm offering. I want to offer them more references so that they can know more about it, just as you've said, to see the world in a grain of sand.
Hmm.
I want to offer more multi-medium version of this grain of sand. So I think I want to build a database. One trouble I'm having is that the guest I'm inviting right now is mostly people I randomly met in life. Like I found them very interesting. I intuitively have this connection to see them as potential people who I can have an interesting conversation with. But I feel like as the project kind of grows in the future, I do have to have some certain directions, but I want to kind of make it a platform where people can offer insights and experience, especially their first-hand stories of how they become the person, the people that they are, the background stories, or the creative process of how an artwork or an artist comes to be. Like it's always a black box for me because I see these cultural products, whether it's books or films or other stuff, they are presented as an enigma, a mystery. You can only interpret it from an outside. But it also has like an inside perspective where it's only open to the creator. I want to know what they think, how they present it, how they make it in a way that it comes to appear to me as an audience. So I want to integrate this perspective into Mental Travelers. My biggest ambition is to make it into uh, a platform where I can have open submissions so that artists, curators, scholars, students, they can have their topics or interested projects to send it to this platform, and then we can make it an open kind of space for people to have discussions and share thoughts and experience. But I imagine would take a long time for me to do that. It has an editorial work and also like maintaining the logistics. It's quite time consuming, but I'm not setting any time limits for myself. I see this project as like a lifelong project. So
Oh,
well,
that's really cool.
yeah, let's see where it grows.
Yeah, I think that makes good sense, and just let the inspiration come to you as you have these conversations.
Yeah.
Like after you contacted me, after we met, I had a look at the website, and I think it's really a cool idea, and I think you're really doing interesting things. So for me, it's a great thing to be a part of that conversation early on, and I hope that you will do many more great things with it. I think you will.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Um, so thank you for talking to me, François. And
You're most welcome, Toya.
Yeah, let's keep talking in the future.
Yes, 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 please. I'm always happy to stay in touch. In fact, the reason for my trip to Beijing was hoping to meet people like yourself. Like I don't know China. I don't know. It was my first time in Beijing, and I know that there's all of these interesting people doing cool things there. So it was really nice to be able to meet a few of them on the trip. And you're one of these people, so I'm really glad to know about you, what you're doing, to participate in a small way to what, you're doing. So hope there might be other ways to collaborate in the future.
Yeah.
Okay. Take care, Toya.
Yeah, take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Have a good weekend.